This tree has been a part of my life for more than 3 decades now. It's beautiful and old and special to me and a lot of people in town, I would say. It's a big old tree with an excellent place to sit and play. And it's, just one of those special beings.
And how does it connect with really what you do in terms of making your own clothes? Do you think there's a connection between how you feel about the tree and nature and making your own clothes?
I mean, I make my own clothes for a lot of reasons. Definitely caring about the planet and its various beings is a big part of my motivation for making my own clothing. I think a lot of us can probably relate to that. I also make clothing because I sort of can't not make clothing. I just love that creative process and find it constantly always fascinating. But yeah, I hand sew most of the clothing that I make these days because I found that as a machine sewist of my own clothing, I was making faster than felt comfortable to me in terms of the amount of output that my enthusiasm was producing. And so my hope is that by slowing my stitching action way down, I can help to reduce that pile that I was accumulating of things I had made, but still enjoy this thing that I love to do.
Can you tell us about what you love about it and how that perhaps influences your well-being?
Yeah, so I love how smart the processes behind making clothing can be. I just love that there's always more to know, there's always more to learn, always people to learn from. I mean, there are so many people around the world and throughout time who make and have made clothes, and there's just so much knowledge there, and then there's just so many opportunities for building on that knowledge and taking it further and taking it into new applications. So it's just constantly fascinating and exciting to me.
In many ways you are self-taught, do you feel?
I am both quite self-taught and formally taught. I did go to school a second time around to the Fashion Institute of Technology to study fashion design, but with a very strong emphasis on pattern making. That was why I went back to school, because I had fallen in love with pattern making and just needed to know everything about it, or as much as I could about it. And that was a great experience. I also had taken some continuing education classes. I was just hungry to learn all that I could. And in terms of sewing, I was taught a bit by my mom, a bit by a couple of classes I took when I was growing up, and a lot by just doing it and having ideas and trying them out. I think that's one of my favorite ways to learn. I love books, I love classes, and I love trying it, wearing it, living in it, studying how it holds up, and just sort of going from there.
So do you find it relaxing, or the opposite perhaps?
I love the is it relaxing question. I know most people, at least it seems to me, most people find making and sewing and knitting, that sort of thing, to be relaxing, and I can see where they're coming from. I mean, there's something wonderfully meditative and focused and slow about making with your hands. I will say I have always found it much too exciting to be relaxing. So it's an extremely positive, energizing thing in my life. I like to mention that when I was younger and I would be knitting, I would have to limit my knitting before bedtime, because if I did it too close to bedtime, I couldn't sleep, because I just spend that time just having these ideas, and it's just far too exciting for me to be able to go to sleep after something like that. So I think it's wonderfully stimulating.
So looking the way your face glows as you talk about that, clearly it's good for your mental health to be making.
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe not for calm, slow, meditative reasons, but
Is it a sense of accomplishment?
Yes, making things is strongly satisfying for me. Just that whole creative process is just, the rhythms of ideas and trying them out and seeing how they go, and continuing that is incredibly satisfying and fulfilling. And also, it's just such a moment of focus for me. You're just kind of like breathing that project or breathing that idea, and it's I don't know, it just kind of brings me all together, I guess, while I'm doing it.
And what happens when things don't work out as you planned? Like, can that be tricky?
It can certainly be tricky when things don't work out as planned, and I mean that happens a lot of the time. So I guess it's sort of a matter of scale. If it goes terribly wrong, it might make me grumpy for a while, and maybe I'd drop that idea for a good long time while I felt grumpy about it, try something else instead. But I mean, those messy times when things don't go the way you thought they would are also where there is so much opportunity for learning, and maybe for having an idea that, well, I don't want to say nobody's ever had before, but the idea wasn't certainly not accessible to you yet in that way, and so going through that friction of trying and having it fail, and then thinking about it, trying a different thing, and eventually finding your way to some sort of answer is really powerful for you, and maybe for other people if you eventually are able to share your discoveries with them.
And so you are sharing a lot, aren't you? You're teaching. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah.
And your book? Tell us that.
Sure. Yeah, so in pattern making and sewing, especially hand sewing, I really love being able to share those skills that I've learned and benefited from and tried to build on. I think it's really, I feel kind of a responsibility to do that, because again, there's so much knowledge to be had in the area of making clothing, and yet there are so many people who don't even realize you can, or maybe they realize you can but don't have easy access to learning that stuff. So I know growing up in a fairly rural place, I had to move to New York City. I had to move to a different state in order to get a fairly comprehensive education in the skills that I cared about so much, and not everybody can do that. That was an extremely privileged thing to be able to do, and I have always wanted to be able to share back what I was able to learn. So that's definitely sort of a life purpose of mine, I think, a goal of mine to share in the ways that I'm able to. So I like to teach it and offer classes in these skills, and I did write a book, Hand Sewing Clothing, a guide, that also seeks to share hand sewing techniques as applied to, especially as applied to modern clothing that one might wear in a kind of modern, everyday context.
And are you finding that there is growing interest in wanting to learn?
There is a very exciting movement, I would say, building in hand sewing clothing, definitely. I've been doing it for some number of years now, and in the past 2 or 3 years, I'd say there's just more and more and more people who are coming to hand sewing, sharing it with others also. Maybe they're just hearing about it for the first time this month, but then they start doing it because it just makes sense. It is slow, which is a wonderful benefit, but there are a lot of other benefits too, like you can take your hand sewing on a picnic. You could hand sew in a willow tree. You can hand sew on an airplane, which I just did a few days ago, and just all of these things would be so much more difficult to do by machine, of course. There's a million other benefits too, but that would take all day. So.
And do you find people comment when they see you hand sewing?
A lot of the hand sewing I do does happen in sort of quiet contexts, like at home, in my yard, or around family who very much already know about what Louisa does with her hand sewing. If I do it out and about, I certainly think people notice. I don't get a whole lot of direct comments, but I think noticing is a good start, even if it's silent noticing.
I have to go and revisit that previous comment you made about the other benefits. Do you want to try and summarise them?
May I refer to page?
Yes, do.
Page. So, page 13. Benefits of hand sewing. Control of the material as you handle it, and of the garment as you realize it. Inconspicuousness where desired, and decorative beauty where desired. So, hand sewing stitches can be very visible and sort of celebrate that they are sewn by hand, but they can also be very subtle so that you wouldn't realize they were sewn by hand unless you were already having your suspicions. Precision, you can be very precise in hand sewing. Portability, as I've mentioned. Affordability, the tools for hand sewing are mostly very affordable, especially compared with buying a sewing machine. Independence from a need for electricity or other fuel while you're sewing. I sewed a skirt during a power outage once, which made me feel pretty smart, and was a fun way to spend that time by candlelight. Slowness, silence. You can stay up late or wake early to stitch, and you won't bother other people with your machine noises. Freedom from machine problems like tension or your bobbin running out or whatever else your machine decides to do that day. Agency and ownership of the creative process and product. Openness to slower, lovelier techniques for a slower, lovelier final product. That I definitely experienced when I started hand sewing. I used to be I would say, a kind of impatient sewist. By machine, I never really wanted to spend more than a day making a thing, so there were certain techniques that I just wasn't really interested in trying because they were just going to take too long. But when you're hand sewing, it will almost certainly take you more than a day. So you become open to, well, if it's going to take me a few hours to do that, maybe I could do it an even cooler, more special way that will be more durable or more beautiful or whatever it is. Not quite done. There are more benefits. Deepest love for your work. Absence from ready-to-wear offerings. You will not find anything like what you would hand sew in a store. Simplicity and sophistication. Increased productivity, because although it is slow to stitch, you can do it anywhere, anytime, without major setup. ease of revision. It's easy to pull out and re-sew as you're sewing. And beauty of the hands, human touch. So those are a few of the benefits of hand sewing.